Hi, happy Wednesday to everyone. We are live for the Museums from Your Home live stream this morning. We're just going to do a little check to make sure everything is working properly as it should on all of our pages. We are streaming to the Office of Archaeological Research's Facebook page, which looks like it is there and correct. It looks like we are also live on the Mountville Archaeological Park and Museum's Facebook page, which is correct. And we should also be streaming from the UA Museums YouTube channel, which you can find at youtube.com/UA Museums. And we're streaming from there. So everything looks good. And so I guess we will go ahead and get started today with our topic, our archaeological topic today. Welcome to today's Museums from Your Home live stream presented by the University of Alabama Museums. My name is Rebecca Johnson, and I'm the Communications Specialist for UA Museums. And joining me today is Matt Gage, the Director of the Office of Archaeological Research, who is going to continue talking to us about Coosa River archaeology. How are you doing today, Matt?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Doing pretty well. I'm excited to continue learning about the Coosa River archaeology. I really enjoyed the first presentation that you did, so it'll be fun to jump back into that. And just a reminder to everybody who is watching while we are broadcasting both here on Facebook and the UA Museums YouTube channel, feel free to ask Matt any questions in the comments, or if you have anything you want to add to the presentation, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And just remember, this is live, so anything can happen. So hang in there with us in case we have any issues. So now that we've gotten some of that business out of the way, Matt, how should we get started talking about Coosa River archaeology today?
All right. Well, first thing, I want to thank Dr. Persons for filling in for me last week. Her presentation on Caribbean archaeology is pretty interesting. That Main Street project that we worked on down there was great. So I really want to thank her and tell her how much we appreciated her help. I'm sorry I missed last week. We were working on a project up in Northeast Alabama, and there is zero cell coverage where we were working. So it was very nice of her to fill in and help us out with that. So and the topic is always interesting. Caribbean archaeology is one of my things that I'm very interested in, and it's, as an archaeologist, you always find things that you don't know. And that area is something new for me, and it's really neat to learn about it and see some of the correlates and connections with the Southeast. So I was very appreciative of her help. So
yeah, that was really cool to learn about.
And she's great. Brooke is a fantastic archaeologist. So we're going to continue talking about the Coosa River Valley archaeology today. So just to kind of recap what we talked about last week, we sort of were going chronologically, and we went through several slides. If you want to go to the next one, we talked about the Coosa River itself, how it's formed up in Georgia, up in northwest Georgia by the Oostenaula and the Etowah rivers. Next slide, please. And we talked about some of the archaeology that had been done in that area. Folks that have worked up there, like Jim Knight and W.B. Jones, the former director of the Museum of Natural History, David DeJarnett, who was the director here at Mountville Archaeological Park and a professor at the university, Ross Morrell, Kerry Oakley, who was my first boss down here at the University of Alabama, Bennett Graham and Benny Keel. All of those guys contributed significantly to what we know about the archaeology of the Coosa Valley. Next slide, please. And then we started going through the chronology, and we made it through the Paleo-Indian stage, and we talked a little bit about the peopling of North America and how folks came into Alabama. And then we talked about the transition into the Archaic stage, with the early Archaic period, seeing a change in lithic technology and the material culture. Go ahead to the next slide. And then on into the Middle Archaic period, where we talked about trade networks and some of the things that were going on with folks moving across the landscape and new subsistence strategies, the way that they were gathering food. Next slide. And we ended that first discussion with the late Archaic period and talking about changes in subsistence and other things that occurred during that time. So now we're going to start with part 2. And today we're going to continue next slide, please. Continue talking about things kind of chronologically, but just to give everybody a refresher, the Coosa River now is one of the major producers of hydroelectric power for the state of Alabama. Alabama Power Company runs several reservoirs on the Coosa River. They work with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to regulate those reservoirs. So they are from the north down to the south: Weiss, Neely Henry, Logan Martin, Lay, Mitchell, Jordan, and Bolden. And if you are lucky enough to get an opportunity to go over and either paddle around on those reservoirs or get a chance to fish on those reservoirs, they're beautiful places to go. A lot of really, really nice houses over there. In fact, I was surprised. I went over the other day. I was surprised at how much construction is going on right now along those reservoirs. So, some really, really neat places to go visit and take a look around. And the wildlife is amazing. We've seen otters swimming over there on Lake Jordan, and it's a beautiful place. There's bald eagles and other things that you can see. So if you get a chance, go over and take a look. All right, next slide. So today we're going to talk about the latter part of prehistory up until European contact. So we're going to talk about the Gulf Formational, which is the earliest ceramic production in the Southeast. And it's named primarily because of the Gulf tradition, where ceramics started to appear along the coast and then started to work their way inland. And we see some of the earliest pottery in Alabama coming out of the Tennessee River Valley, and just a little bit of it is starting to occur in the Coosa Valley. There's changes in settlement patterns at this time. Folks seem to be taking advantage of completely different resources than they had prior. And a lot of that's related to environmental changes, climate change. At this point, we're well into the Holocene, and we've got conditions that are very similar to today. And people seem to be taking advantage of places like swamps and locations that they hadn't been taking advantage of as intensely prior to this. There's shifts in lithic technology. You are seeing a transition from the atlatl and spears to other types of technology. And it shows up in the arrowheads that are being made by the people at this time. And then we are going to talk about the Woodland and a little bit about monumental architecture, back to the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail stuff. And we're going to talk about exchange networks and, again, changes in settlement patterns, where people are living, the introduction of horticulture into the Southeast in this area. Then we're going to talk about the Mississippian with the civic ceremonial centers, the transition to settlement in larger villages and farmsteads. We're going to talk a little bit about trade networks and alliances, which are so important to these people. And then post-contact, we're talking about population change. Again, we're going to mention the massive decline in native populations resulting from European contact, and what trade meant to both native and European folks that came over, and how they benefited, I guess you'd say, from that interaction. So, next slide. So to start with, what we had been talking about before was primarily based on a chronology that's formed from our understanding of prehistory that comes not only from carbon dating and other things, but diagnostic artifacts. And the majority of the diagnostic artifacts that we know from prior to the Gulf Formational are all lithics. And those lithics tend to show the transition from different hunting strategies and different tool use, all the way through from the Paleo-Indian, when people first came, into the late Archaic. But by the time we get to the late Archaic, we start to see changes in the needs of the people, and they start making containers out of stone, soapstone in particular, to some much lesser degree, sandstone. And as time goes on, they realize that they can also make containers out of pottery. And, for us, container technology doesn't seem like it's, that exciting of a topic, maybe, but it really is. And you want to talk about the advent of a new technology that completely transformed the way that people lived. Pottery just completely altered subsistence strategies, cooking methods, trade networks, things that archaeologists can use to show connections between regions and to show the transitions through time. So it's a big shift. And I mentioned briefly the introduction of pottery, and one in the Tennessee Valley, and the first pottery that we see in Alabama. And the first type of pottery is tempered with fiber. And when I talk about temper, I mean material that's included in with the clay that helps to bind it together to make containers stick together. Because if you just take clay, it can become a very weak structure, and you have to have inclusions in it that help to bind it together. So the first ceramics that we see are fiber tempered. And one of the very first types of fiber that's incorporated is Spanish moss. And we see that in coastal settings. But in the Tennessee Valley, they're using other materials, other types of fiber to help bind things together. And assumedly, that's because they don't necessarily have Spanish moss in that area. But they're using other types of fiber. And then as time goes on, we see a transition from fiber as a dominant temper type to sand being used as a temper type. And that's where we start to see pottery really become popular in the Coosa Valley. Alexander series ceramics are prevalent within the Coosa River Valley. And we know that by about 500 BC or so, folks are adopting all this container technology. And prior to that, they had sort of been resisting. And that may be a situation where the cultures in the Tennessee Valley had acquired this technology, but the people in the Coosa Valley didn't really want a whole lot to do with them and weren't adopting that new container technology. But after this, between about 500 BC and 100 BC, people really start to pick it up. And you see connections with the Tennessee Valley. There's pottery that typically is only found, or excuse me, is dominant in the Tennessee Valley that starts to show up in the Coosa Valley. So we see things like Colbert series ceramics being tied in, but we also see stuff coming out of northern Georgia, like the Kellogg series ceramics. And then as time goes on, we start to see more of a connection to Georgia and slightly less of a connection to the Tennessee Valley, with connections to the Etowah area. And we know from middle woodland sites in the Chocolaco Valley and other areas that these people are tied very closely with the people in up around Etowah. And the Etowah site later in times becomes very important. Etowah is sort of a contemporary of Moundville, much later in the Mississippian. And those two areas interact, but the people in the Coosa Valley seem to be tied more closely with the folks up in the Etowah area than they are with the Mississippian. But we'll get to that as we go through this. So during the late Woodland, we start to see a transition where between 8700 and 1200, this association with various locations shifts again. And we see early on, go ahead back to the pottery one. We see early on that folks are tied more closely with Cartersville ceramics and this relationship to the Etowah area. And then it transitions back to a relationship with the Flint River culture up in the Tennessee River Valley. And then again, during the late Woodlands, you start to see this push of people coming out of the West Jefferson culture in central Alabama, kind of pushing their way into the Coosa Valley, the middle Coosa Valley. So, we have talked in the past about populations shifting across the landscape and how population dynamics are really important as we look at the transition of cultures through time. And the influences that we recognize from these different cultures are evident, and you can use that archaeologically to show how populations and cultures change through time. And the West Jefferson folks are really interesting because they're sort of the last vestige of the woodland before we get to Mississippian. And in particular, the Ellis phase folks, you can tell they're being pushed from the west by the introduction of Mississippian people, and they're pushing their way towards the east and affecting people further over into the Coosa Valley. And we've seen at several sites in the Cahaba Valley to the west and into the Coosa Valley where conflict is evident. And it's like these West Jefferson people are coming in and they're either going to take over or you're going to assimilate. So I lost the video on one of my things. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. So for you, Rebecca, I know you like Star Trek. So you got to think of like the Borg. You either assimilate or die. And that seems to be what's happening a lot of times in these areas. And these West Jefferson folks are kind of pushing their way in, and you either assimilate their ceramics and traditions or you get attacked and run off. So,
yeah, technically, I'm a Star Wars girl, but I know about the Star Trek and the Borg. So I think that's a good analogy, though.
The museum's accountant, Victoria Matthews, is a total Trekkie.
Yeah, I think we have several Trekkies. So it's good to learn. I know more about the Star Wars, the I guess the Star of the Wars. So it's good to know more about Star Trek. I'm learning about Star Trek through some other people.
Gotcha. Well, I'm a neophyte in both realms at this point. Once you get past Return of the Jedi, I'm pretty well lost.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep up with.
Yeah, absolutely. But I got to say, if you look at what's happening with the Empire, then and the way that they are taking over planets, it's very similar to what's happening with populations in Alabama during this time. You've got this massive force that's coming into the area, and you either rebel and you maintain your own traditions, or you assimilate and you learn how to make their type of pottery, and you learn how to make their type of projectile points, and you become involved with their trade networks and the alliances that form as a result of that, or you maintain your rebellious nature and you keep to your traditions, and you're left fighting constantly.
Wow, I'm really impressed with your pun game. It's really strong there. So I'm super impressed.
I can relate. Sometimes it's difficult for archaeologists that stay out in the woods and in the dirt to assimilate.
So you still there, Matt? Oh yeah, I still got you. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good. I lost you for a second, but I got you back.
All right. I don't know if you can see me or not. I can't see myself. So.
Okay, let's see.
That's not a big deal.
Yeah, it looks like maybe we lost your video, but I'll just go full screen on the presentation then. So we should be good. Actually, I'll take myself out and then I'll go. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, we can do that. Okay. All right. So you should be good.
All right. So we're back talking about the Mississippian introduction into the area. So they start to move in, and we don't see a lot of evidence in the northern Coosa Valley for the introduction of Mississippian until a little bit later in time. So the time period we're talking about now is about AD 1200 to 1500. But in the Middle Valley, you do start to see a lot of associations with the Mississippian cultures that are working their way into the area. In particular, this Ellis phase, and after that, you even see some Moundville influence in the valley. But as time progresses, we see that the majority of the ceramics become tied more closely with classic Etowah pottery, which indicates that these people are interacting more heavily with folks up in Northwest Georgia and accepting their traditions and cultural trends. And by the end of it, we start to see the Lamar pottery being very common across the Middle Valley, with some of it appearing up into the northern regions. And by contact, we know that most of the Coosa Valley is dominated by the creek, and we see typical creek pottery like McKee Island incised with curvilinear and rectilinear stamped pottery throughout the valley. So next slide, please. All right, so changes in lithic technology. Again, we talked about the atlatl and spears and their use during Paleo-Indian and Archaic. And what we start to see is a transition from, these larger projectile points associated with spears and things to smaller projectile points in time that are related to the introduction of the bow and arrow. And by the time we get to contact, we have very nice small projectile points, including things like Dallas points and Madison points and Hamilton points, which are small triangular points. Sometimes they're small enough that they're not even likely to have been used on bows and arrows, but rather on darts. And we know that blowguns were very important for these folks. And whether or not these tiny projectile points that we see were actually mounted on those, I'm not certain of. More likely they maintained the use of the bows and arrows, but the arrowheads are used on the bows and arrows. But we see this transition through time. And we know, again, that the lithic technology is very dependent on the types of raw material that these people can access. So up in northern Coosa Valley, we see things like Conasauga chert, and we see the introduction of some Fort Payne and Bangor chert into the area. And we see a little bit of Knox chert used in that area as well, but there's a lot of quartzite. In fact, if you look at this slide, the majority of the projectile points on here are quartzite. And as time goes on, we start to see this transition continue where you don't see as many non-local raw material types as you do early on until you get to the Mississippian, at which time you start to see more non-local material being traded into the area. A lot of it seems like it's coming out of northern Georgia and other places, but these projectile points go from relatively large. If you look at this slide up in the top left there, you can see that great big projectile point up on the top on the right side. And that undoubtedly is associated with spears or atlatls. And then if you go down to the lower right side, you'll start to see those projectile points becoming much smaller. In fact, one of the very common types in the Coosa Valley is called the Coosa notched. And it's a relatively small to medium-sized projectile point that seems like it's rather ubiquitous in its use. You can either use it for a spear or you can use it for an arrow. And either one, it would fit very well. And the size is probably indicative of the fact that they were being used for both things. So next slide, please. Ground stone technology also changes as we go through time. And you start to see things like, we mentioned container technology, and we mentioned that during the late Archaic, you start to see soapstone bowls, and soapstone bowls are very common in the Coosa Valley. And there's two main sources of soapstone. One in this area, one is going to be up in the Southern Appalachians, in Tennessee and North Carolina. If anybody has ever been up to the Smokies, there's several areas around there, Tuckaleechee Cove being one, that has soapstone available. And there's another in Alabama, along Raccoon Creek in Tallapoosa County, where there is a really interesting soapstone quarry site with bowl stumps exposed on the outcrop. And we know that just from looking at the outcrop, that a massive portion of it has been quarried away for folks to make soapstone bowls. Now, soapstone occurs throughout the Appalachians and the Piedmont, all the way up into Nova Scotia. In fact, Van King has been up to Nova Scotia plenty of times to take a look at the quarry sites up there. And their quarries are much different than the quarries we see down here. They actually would etch almost like a grid pattern into the outcrop. And instead of making round containers, they were making square containers. And when we see the soapstone outcrops in the South that have been used, they look like they have pimples almost, because these bowl stumps remain, and they're sort of a bump that sticks up, but they're basically all that remains from the natives quarrying down around that bump, and then they would have cut underneath it, so it almost looked like a mushroom, and then breaking that top off and then hollowing the bowl out. And the tools that are used to make these bowls are relatively simple. They're typically just quartz bifaces, rough quartz bifaces. And some of the bowls are absolutely beautiful with decorations on the rims. We talked about in the past how a lot of times if the bowls were broken, they would patch them using sinew to lash through holes that were drilled in the side of the bowl, and then patching them with pitch or some other type of adhesive, that would ensure that they remained watertight. But that bowl technology has gradually transitioned away from soapstone into the ceramics. And that transition takes a lot of time. And it looks like people continue to use the soapstone bowls all the way up into the Woodland. And it's probably because that soapstone has certain qualities for heating that pottery just doesn't. It can handle much more dynamic changes in temperature and retain heat very well for long periods of time, where the thinner walled ceramics often don't maintain the heat the same way. We see an increase in the manufacture of beads, although beads begin to appear in the Middle Archaic. We see an increase during the Woodland, and the technology associated with bead production ties in directly a lot of times with soapstone production. If they had broken a bowl and it was unusable, a lot of times they would recycle the pieces and turn those pieces into things like beads or even pipes. And we see tobacco being introduced early on in this area, and we know that folks are manufacturing pipes and using pipes from as early as the Middle Archaic, but it really starts to become more common in the Woodland and again in the Mississippian. And we see both the types of pipes that you'd expect to see, today, which are sort of elbow pipes. They're kind of L-shaped, and a lot of them are things that you would recognize today as a pipe. But we also see things called cloud blowers, which are tubular pipes, and oftentimes they were used in um, uh, ceremonies associated with healing people that were sick, where they would have the shaman or the medicine provider inhale smoke from a certain type of fire, whether it be tobacco or some other type of um, smoke, and then they would blow it through the cloud blower onto the affected area of the individual, with the idea that it would help to remove whatever evil spirits or illness that individual was experiencing. Uh, we also see the introduction of pallet technology during the transition from the Woodland into the Mississippian. If anybody's ever seen the rattlesnake disc here at Moundville, that's an example of a pallet. But there are also much simpler pallets that are simply natural pieces of limestone or sandstone that are ground down, and typically they're used for um, processing paints. You see a lot of ochre, whether it's yellow or red ochre, being processed on these pallets and used to grind the raw ores down to make the paint. We see stone being used as net sinkers. We talked about changes in subsistence strategies, and one of the major changes is the introduction of fish weirs. And fish weirs are the most efficient way to fish in the rivers and streams that we have here in Alabama. In fact, they're so efficient that they were outlawed in the 20s because you could have a community basically decimate fish population by using or overusing fish weirs. But one way to use the fish weir is to have a net that is set down at the point on the fish weir. And if anybody has ever seen a fish weir, they're basically large V's made out of logs or stones. Sometimes they're sticks that are driven into the mud in the bottom of the river. And they form a V all the way across the river with only one outlet at the bottom of the V. And what people would do was start upstream and start walking down, scaring the fish and pushing them forward. And as the fish came to the V, they would be herded to that opening at the end. And when they went through the opening, they would either be captured in nets or baskets, or sometimes they would make what's called a fish ladder, in which case the fish kind of goes up out of the water onto a wooden series of steps almost, and then they could just stand there and pick the fish out of the ladder and toss them into baskets. But the introduction of net sinkers and the use of net sinkers takes off during the Woodland as well. We see it earlier on, but during this time, they become even more common. Now, we have talked about the introduction of agriculture and horticulture into the Southeast before, and it's during the Woodland. It begins during the late Archaic, but during the Woodland, it really takes off, and we start to see anvil stones and grinding stones increase in numbers, and manos and metates are another term that's used to refer to these, and they're used for processing fine grains and corn. And we know that corn starts to become more popular during the Mississippian when it is a staple of the majority of Mississippian diets. We can tell that from skeletal remains that have been examined that show that the starches and sugars that are found in corn are evident in the skeletal remains. So manos and metates are another use for groundstone. And then we see things like decorations. Besides beads, we have gorgets. And some of these gorgets are beautifully carved stone gorgets that have intricate designs on them or incorporate motifs or iconography that represent traditional cultural elements that show up on pottery and other things. And those gorgets are, just absolutely beautiful pieces of artwork that's made on these groundstone pieces. So, next slide, please. All right, so subsistence strategies. We talked about how during the Gulf formational, we started to see people taking advantage of places and resources that they hadn't been, in particular swampy areas. But we see transitions through time where sometimes shell fishing is very common and times when it's not. And that's probably not so much the result of people's taste changing and not wanting to eat shellfish. It's probably more likely associated with changes in environments and the amount of silt that's occurring in the Coosa River Valley. And we know that we start to see a major transition during the late Archaic where people are taking advantage of modifying their environment through the use of fire, prescribed fires, where they're burning off underbrush and they're burning off unwanted vegetation in an effort to try to promote things like mast forests, where you have oak and chestnut and hickory, trees that produce nuts that people can subsist off of. And as time goes on, we see people either taking advantage of fire where they're burning big areas. In fact, we talked about DeSoto and how during his travels through the Southeast, they looked at huge areas that had what they identified as massive orchards that extended for miles out from villages. And we know from ethnohistorians and ethnographic documentation that the forests in a lot of areas were wide open. If you go out into the forests in Alabama today, the majority of them have been timbered, and you don't get to see what the forest would have been like during the time that before European contact, where there were big, massive trees, and the understory was pretty open. William Bartram talks about being able to ride a horse at full gallop through the forests in Alabama because there really isn't much of an understory. It's either been removed by these prescribed burns, or the canopies are so dense from huge mature forests that the understory doesn't get a chance to really get started. But if you go out into the forests of Alabama today, they are typically very dense, particularly if you go to an area that has recently been timbered and start watching the transition. You start to see things coming back like blackberries first, and they become very thick. And as those are surpassed by saplings that grow up and shade them out, you start to see things like cedar trees and sweet gum trees take over areas. And depending on the soil conditions, different types of vegetation will thrive until those forests transition back to a mature status. And large parts of Alabama were dominated by longleaf forest, but a lot of it was also oak hickory forest. And how much of those forests were managed by native prescribed fires, we really don't know at this point. But we have an indication, again, from ethnohistorians and even the archaeological records showing the types of trees and vegetation that were in areas that people were taking advantage of fire and burning massive areas. And one of the things that does by removing the understory is opens up soils to a lot more erosion. When you don't have the leaf litter and you don't have a dense understory with complex root systems and branches sheltering the surface and holding the soil back, you end up seeing much more runoff. If you think about an agricultural field today where we typically take out all of the vegetation and then plow it up and right after a rainstorm, if that field is on a hill, you'll notice that a lot of the soil runs downhill. And it's the same with a lot of these forests that were cleared of their understories prior to European contact. We know that we see increases in siltation in the river valleys during various times, and undoubtedly those are being influenced by increases in undoubtedly by increases in precipitation with changing environmental factors, but also by these prescribed burns and the removal of understory and detritus that helps to protect the ground from erosion. So if you look at the image in the lower right, you'll notice the white stuff. Those are all shells. And this is a pit that had been excavated down. And we've talked in the past about shell middens and shell pits. And if anybody has spent time at the coast and been near a place where people have processed shellfish, over time, it smells absolutely horrible. As those things deteriorate and rot, it's a pretty awful smell. So I'm of the opinion that one of the reasons that they buried a lot of the shell in pits was just to get rid of the smell. But there's also a lot of other reasons that they were using shell. Shell is a great preservative. The calcium carbonate in the shell helps to alter the acidic nature of soils in Alabama, so things won't rot as easily. In fact, we see shell used oftentimes in burials. And it's probably because shell is sacred to many Southeastern Native Americans. And whether or not that's shell that has been used to manufacture things like beads or gorgets or other things, or if it's just the shell itself. And I know at one of the recent talks that Dr. Donop gave, he talked about the importance of shell and how at some coastal sites, you see only one side of a bivalve. So if you think of a clam, you open it up, there's two halves to it. Only one side is used in the shell midden deposits. And for them to have selected only one side of the shell indicates that they had a very important reason for doing so. And we know that shell isn't just something that gets thrown away into big shell midden piles, but that the shell middens themselves are significant as monumental architecture. They represent a person's hold on a landscape. You know, they're very likely territorial markers that indicate where people are living. And if you've ever traveled up and down the Tennessee Valley, or the Tennessee River, or the Coosa River, or the Alabama River, a lot of places you'll see these big shell deposits coming out of the bank. Well, think about if you were traveling in a canoe 1,000 years ago, and you came along around the bend in the river, and all of a sudden there's a massive white riverbank. That instantly tells you that you have entered somebody's territory, and you better hope that they're friendly or you can make an alliance with them, because they clearly are showing their occupation of the landscape by having that massive white monumental feature sitting right there on the riverbank. As time goes on and we see the introduction of agriculture, we start to see people taking more advantage of broad areas of river bottoms. And one of the main reasons for that is for agricultural fields. Corn is a domesticated plant that takes up a lot of space. For you to plant enough corn to sustain a family for a year requires several acres. And we know that these river bottoms are being cleared. We know that we see increased runoff as a result of that clearing, but we know that they are using these cleared fields to produce large crops of corn, which are then stored for long periods of time. So, in Alabama, we're lucky that we have a very long growing season. And if you're lucky enough, you can actually get two crops of things during the summer. And if you're following the pattern that we know for the Mississippian, where they're growing the triumvirate, the three sisters, maize, beans, and squash, um, you can produce enough over that duration of time, and then processing it and storing it for long periods of time, that you'll have plenty to feed your family and your village for the entire year. Now we know that there's a lot of conflict during this time. We've looked at palisaded Mississippian villages up and down the Coosa River. And when I say palisaded, I mean walled villages. So these are towns that would have had restricted access. There would have been gates through these big walls that would have surrounded the towns. And if you are building a defensive feature like that, it's because you're dealing with conflicts. You're afraid somebody's going to come in and attack you. And one of the main reasons for doing that, if you put yourself into the position of the people that lived at that time, if you happen to have planted your fields and something happened, you didn't get enough rain, or you didn't have, you had a late frost or something that killed the majority of your plants off, you got a blight, you've got to find a way to produce enough food to feed your family. And if you can't grow it yourself, another option is to go steal it from somebody. And there's a lot of evidence of folks attacking each other. They're living in these massive walled villages, and they're taking advantage of the protection that these walls afford. And then they're clearing the surrounding river bottoms adjacent to the fortifications. They're farming them and then gathering all the material together and bringing it inside the fortification to have for the remainder of the year. So we start to see big portions of the river valleys being cleared for agricultural fields, and we start to see these palisaded villages kind of grow in size. And we can tell some of the social structure from the way that these villages are laid out and the way that these people are handling the domesticates that they're growing. And we know that there is a system of tribute that begins to develop, where people have created alliances. In this area, we know, for instance, that in the Choccolocco Valley, they're tied directly with the folks up at the Etowah site up in northwest Georgia. And they're sharing technology like container technology, where they're making ceramics the same way. Lithic technology, they're probably exchanging everything from food to spouses to anything you can trade, they're trading. But places like Etowah are lucky in the sense that they can gather tribute. They're big, they're powerful, people want to become their friend. They can gather tribute from some of these places, like the smaller mound sites and villages on Choccolocco Creek. And they have the opportunity then to have individuals who don't necessarily have to be constantly involved with subsistence strategies, with making enough food for themselves. They can become artisans and priests and politicians and do things that allow them to be focusing their time on other things other than finding enough food to subsist. I know we've talked in the past a little bit about the transition from hunter-gatherers to agriculture and whether or not that's easier or better for people. But if you consider the amount of time that a hunter-gatherer tends to work, it's about 9 hours a week is all they really need to create enough subsistence to sustain their family for a week. By the time you get into agriculture, there are times of the year where you are working constantly trying to maintain those fields. whether that's during the time of planting or during the time of maintenance or during the time of harvest. And what comes with that new introduction of agriculture and the ability to store enough food for yourself is this trade-off where you're working more. You have to protect the resources that you've produced, and you have to come up with new strategies for creating alliances. And as a consequence of that, you see an increase in politics where you don't just have these egalitarian societies where everybody is sort of the same. There isn't really any one group that's more powerful than anyone else. But by the time you see these big civic ceremonial complexes like Etowah being created, you have a hierarchy where you have individuals that are leaders that are controlling other subordinates below them. And again, you see this whole system of tribute. Now, compare that to us today, where so many of us we work for a living, or we teach for a living, or you may work in a factory producing cars, or you may work in a chicken plant processing chickens. Every one of us pays taxes, and those dollars go to our government to help do things like protect us and to help come up with things like healthcare that can work to try to keep us safe in this time of COVID-19. And it was the same back then. If you were living in one of these polities and you had somebody like a chief that was taking care of you, if you got attacked by somebody and they stole all your food, you could go to the person that you're paying tribute to and say, "Hey, I need some help. Can you give me some food for the year?" And they would. And that ends up really allowing populations to blossom and grow and to become involved with other things, like if you're spending all your time making pottery or making stone tools, or you're making things like beautifully carved pallets or gorgets or other things, shell carvings. You may not have as much time as you need to be able to find food to feed yourself, but if you're doing it for somebody, they can pay you in the form of food. So, all right. That was a very long-winded explanation of the transition and subsistence strategies. So,
no, I think that was very informative. Thanks for digging in deep and going through it.
Next slide, please. So the Mississippian stage ends with the introduction of Europeans into the Southeast. And we know that Hernando de Soto was one of the first Europeans to make it into the interior. He forms alliances with some groups. He massacres others. Some people are friendly when he knocks on their door and says, "Hey, can you provide me and my soldiers some food?" And others recognize that he is bringing a total terror with him, and they instantly attack him or they run away and hide. But we see a whole series of expeditions that come into the Southeast. So we've got De Soto, we've got De Luna, and we've got the Pardo expeditions that all traveled through the Southeast trying to find things that they could take back to Europe or find riches that would make them noblemen. And De Soto's thing was looking intently for gold. And he had been told by some that there was gold in the southeastern region, and that if he just moved on to the next village, he would find it. And a lot of what they were talking about wasn't gold, but copper. And copper is very common in the Southeast. traded both from the Great Lakes area and from the East Tennessee area in the Appalachians, where there are copper ore deposits. And he was probably very disappointed when he found out that there wasn't any gold in the Southeast. So we started looking at other ways that he could become rich, and other resources that they could take. And one of the things that they talk about is pearls. And they talk about the walls of some of the structures in the city of Coosa being covered with strings of pearls. And they gather a lot of pearls from the cities and villages that they visit. But most likely, these aren't actually pearls. More likely, they're shells that have been carved into beads. So we know that from their expedition, they were trying very intently to find ways to acquire things from southeastern indigenous populations. And one of the things that they brought with them was disease. And it wiped out 75 to 90% of the populations here in the Americas. People did not have the immunity to things like smallpox and chickenpox. And they just absolutely decimated the populations, the indigenous populations of the Southeast. But when the conquistadors failed in their efforts to acquire gold, they did succeed in identifying other things that would be considered very useful to Europeans. And one of those things was deer hide and trapping of things like beavers. Next slide, please. So trade becomes incredibly important to the Southeast, and you have the Spanish, the English, and the French all vying to work with tribes to acquire things that they could take back to Europe, namely hides. And they start bringing in things like beads and brass kettles and iron implements, hoes and harpoons and hatchets and other cast iron pots and things that they can trade with the indigenous populations for hides. And gradually they start to exchange firearms with the southeastern tribes. And you have trappers in the Southeast that are decimating both the deer and the rodent populations. In fact, deer were so scarce in Alabama right up until they were reintroduced by the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the 30s. I've talked in the past about deer pens out here in the Okmulgee National Forest, where they brought in deer from the Midwest with the intent of rebuilding the populations of the Southeast. And they weren't decimated just by hunting from early Americans. They were also decimated by indigenous populations that were harvesting them for trade goods with the Spanish, the English, and the French. In the top right-hand corner of this slide is a sword that was found at Woods Island. And that sword is very interesting in that it's a British hanger sword. And it would have been considered a very important item by whoever owned it, whether European or indigenous. And I would imagine that that was traded to somebody who was considered to be very important, probably one of the Creek who were occupying that portion of the Coosa Valley. And that sword is really, really interesting. And it would have been owned by an officer in the British military. And for him to have exchanged it with someone, an indigenous person, would indicate to me that they had a very, very close relationship. And that's what we tend to see is relationships between traders and the native populations become very intense. And a lot of times they intermarry into the tribes. And we've talked in the past about how the French really promoted that. They told their soldiers to take advantage of assimilating with native populations, taking native wives, and helping to convince those native populations that they should continue to trade with the French. And as time goes on, the French lose influence in the South, and the English tend to dominate. They've at various times, we see the French being dominated, we see the Spanish being dominated, we see the English being dominant until the American Revolution, at which time the English are taking over the vast majority of the trade in this region. They have established forts along the Atlantic coast and Charleston in particular. The French have Mobile and New Orleans, and the Spanish have Spanish Florida. And gradually we see the Creek in particular side with the English. And one of the things that's really interesting is you can see the gun technology transition from where you have French armaments being changing through time to predominantly English armaments. And if you look kind of down in the right-hand corner of this slide, you'll see a honey-colored stone. I can't see your cursor very well. Up to the right. Yep, right in there. So that's a French gunflint that came from a site in the Coosa Valley. But gradually you start to see the transition to British gunflints start to be more common. And the main difference between the two is French gunflints are honey-colored, and the British gunflints are typically gray. So, well, I know I've run out of time. I think I'm about a minute past my time at this point, so I'm going to end it there. The final slide, if you want to, or not. The final slide just thank you, so it's no big deal. I'm sorry again that I had technical difficulties here, but I'm ugly to begin with, so I'm glad you can't see me.
No.
I hope everybody.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Matt.
I hope everybody has a little better understanding of the archaeology of the Coosa Valley. And by all means, if you've got questions or anything, just reach out to us. We'll be happy to answer any questions that we can.
Let's see. Matt, do you have time for just one question before we go? So Ron asks, how difficult is it to date standalone, do not know strata found in lithic artifacts? It seems lots of modern or fake artifacts are produced and passed off as authentic, especially napped points. Does that...
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Have become a very common thing that's sold on eBay or other sites, and trying to determine fakes from the real thing is difficult. And we in no way promote the sale of artifacts in any way, shape, or form, primarily because it leads people to think that it's okay to go out and dig this stuff up and destroy the information that they offer. And while you might have a pretty rock, you've lost all the information that goes along with that pretty rock. So it's very easy to date projectile points by their morphology. You can tell as time goes on, they change the styles that they were making. And archaeologists can typically look at a projectile point and get a pretty good idea of what time that comes from. But being able to determine the difference between what's a fake projectile point and what's a real projectile point takes a little more care, particularly since folks that are trying to sell these fake ones are doing things like putting them in rock tumblers to give them a little bit of a patina, or they're doing intentional things to them to try to make them look older than they really are. But some of the guys that are really good at napping will intentionally put something on their projectile point that they know that that's one that they made, and nobody else will be able to show it as one that was found or one that was sold as an antiquity. So I know one guy that actually micro etches his name onto the projectile points that he makes. So you can't see it just by looking at the artifact unless you're looking at a microscope.
Wow, that's really cool. Well, thanks, Matt, for taking us through that archaeology and that history and showing us all about the information of that area. I certainly learned a lot, so I appreciate you coming on and sharing that with us. If you do want to keep in touch with everything that we're doing here at UA Museums with the Museums from Your Home initiative that we've started, you can go to museums.ua.edu/museums from your home. That will have all the information you'll need about how to watch and where to watch, and additional resources that we have, educational resources from Discovering Alabama, the Alabama Museum of Natural History, as well as Moundville Archaeological Park. So you can go and check that out there. If you want to make sure that you never miss a live stream or any of the video content that we put out, you can go subscribe to the UA Museums YouTube channel at youtube.com/UA Museums. That's a great way to keep up with us. And if you're enjoying what we're doing here, you can become a supporting member of UA Museums by going to give.ua.edu/museums. It's a great way to support what we do. All right. Well, thank you to everyone who watched and everyone who will watch in the future for visiting UA Museums from your home. Hope everybody has a great Wednesday.
Thank you.